We have some breaking news for you out of the Russia-Ukraine war. And actually, in this particular case, some of the news is breaking elsewhere in Europe. There is right now going on live as we speak a summit in Ramstein, Germany, where the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is hosting a whole roundtable of other countries. Oftentimes 15 different nations have been invited and representatives are there. This time it's very unusual because Zelensky himself has been there. These happen nearly every month where they get together and they try to see what new things can the West give. And there's usually a lot of flowery statements. You hadn't heard much from it lately because not a lot's going on. But now then the urgency for Zelensky is quite high. So he wanted to personally come this time to make some comments and to emphasize how important some things are to him. More on that in a second. What you're going to see, though, is that it's not just what the Ukraine and the United States are saying, but also what the Russian side is saying. And then there's what's actually happening on the ground. Because like so often here, if you just listen to one side or the other and you believe them, take them at face value, your understanding of the ground truth may be a little bit skewed. What we love to do here at Deep Dive is not take anything at face value, but we listen to the words. And then we look on the ground to see what actually lines up. And as is usually the case, quite unfortunately, what we're going to find out is that most of the things we see from the Western and Kiev side are the farthest away from what's actually happening on the ground. A lot of spin going on, a lot of propaganda, as Larry Johnson said on our show yesterday. And really, it's hard to use any other language besides that. The weird thing about it is, to me, and I still haven't wrapped around this, I can get why you want to put a positive spin on things and look good to your people in certain cases. But when doing so actually blinds them to what's actually going on the ground and your people are dying as a result and the front lines are moving against you, then I don't see what they gain by fooling people for a little bit longer, because the truth is advancing to the West. And very soon it's going to be impossible to hide anything. More on that later as well. We're also going to have from the Russian side, we have some comments. The general of the Ukrainian armed forces, General Syrskyi, had to sit down with an interview with CNN. So it's a full-on media barrage by the Ukraine side and the Western side. But let's see how it's playing out. First of all, let's hear some comments that were made just a little while ago by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's not kid ourselves. Putin will not stop at Ukraine. But as President Biden has said, Ukraine can stop Putin if we stand with Ukraine and provide the weapons that it needs to defend itself. Ukraine's survival is on the line, and all of our security is on the line. So we will continue to stand together to resist Putin's campaign of conquest, and we will continue to keep the faith with the people of Ukraine.
Okay, this is just, it's just hard for me to fathom how the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America, that self-styles itself as the most powerful nation in the history of the world, can sit there with a straight face again, full 2.5 years into the war, and tell you that Putin is like this steamroller. He's just like Hitler, and he won't stop here. My God, we have to stop them here or all of our security is at risk. But then you look at the map, and I'm going to show you here in a little bit this 90-day progress in an area of Pokrovsk, which is, I don't know, it's I think somewhere around 50 miles, somewhere along that line. And you're going to see it takes 90 days to go 50 miles for the Russian side. And that's a significant advancement over the previous advances that they've been having. And you see at 2.5 years war, how far Russia's gotten. And it's not very far going against a country that has no allies on the ground fighting with it. And somehow you're expected to believe the Secretary of Defense of the United States to tell you with a straight face, with a deep, voice about how serious this is, that Russia's going to keep going if we don't stop them here. Really? 2.5 years, they've made like just about a fifth of the outside of Ukraine with no allies. And then I'm supposed to believe that if we don't stop them here, he's going to keep going? I mean, what's it going to take another, 4 or 5 years for him to get all the way to the western edges of Ukraine? I mean, I don't know. We'll see what happens, because war is not a straight line dynamic like that, as I tell you several times. But you see at face value, it's ridiculous for him to say that. And then, of course, he wants you to believe that our security is on the line, because otherwise it doesn't make a lot of sense. if you take what's actually happening on the ground and you say, Ukraine doesn't have the fundamentals of war necessary to win. They don't have the manpower, the industrial capacity, the Air Force, air defense. And by the way, he's at this event right here earlier today. I've already seen him making emphatic pleas to get more air defense. He's accusing the West of having made promises that they're going to give him things and then not delivering them. They've only given them a certain amount, even though these things keep getting knocked out routinely by the Russian side. Every time we keep giving them stuff in the air defense, the Russians keep knocking them out. So there's that. But he wants you to believe, as Austin does, that you need to keep the faith and you need to keep on believing that we're going to win and that everything is important to us because we'll be next in the line. Because if you don't believe that, our security is at stake, then you have to ask, why are we continuing to fund a war that won't succeed? And listen, folks, that's exactly what happened in Afghanistan for 20-something years. And there was many people like Matthew Ho and several others that were beating those drums about saying, hey, you're not going to win, even though we keep claiming that we are. So you see, there's a consistent pattern here of lying, because I can't think that Austin's doing anything besides that. And I'm sure that in his mind, he probably says, well, I'm not lying per se. I'm just giving a positive spin on it. No, it's a lie. And we'll just call it what it is, because you know the fundamentals of war that I talk about here better than I do, because you've got classified information to both sides, stuff that I don't have access to. But what even I can see just on publicly available maps and just watching the progress and then watching what happens on the ground here, it's self-evident that the Ukraine side can't win. So for him to tell us otherwise is a lie. But that's nothing new here. But I just want to make sure that you're aware of it. So when you hear these quotes and statements coming out, make sure you understand the truth. Well, then we're going to look to see what Zelensky himself had to say. So later on, right after Austin had spoke, Zelensky goes on, and he's going to talk a little bit about their strategy and what he says was successful during the Kursk invasion.
Today marks 1 month since our army's operation began in the Kursk region of Russia. This is the borderland from which Putin was preparing to expand the war into Ukrainian territory. He was preparing to launch a new offensive against our city of Sumy, and we have turned the tables and are pushing the war into Russia through our counter-offensive. So far, during the first month of our operation in the Kursk region, the Russian forces have lost about 6,000 soldiers killed and wounded in Kursk only, and other tens of thousands of Russian troops in other war zones. Thanks to our actions, there is currently no threat that Russia will launch a new offensive operation on our territory against the city of Sumy.
So that last part, we'll start with that last first, his claim that now then there will be no Russian invasion into Sumy. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Maybe Russia had a plan to do that, and maybe they didn't. That's one of those that it's really impossible to prove because it never happened, because there was lots of troops, Russian troops down in that area. But there is a potential other purpose for that those troops that he was talking about there in the Russian area. Because here's the interesting thing. He says that the Russian side was preparing to invade into the Sumy area. Ergo, he's claiming, and by the way, we've mentioned it on this channel in the last couple of months, that there was a large grouping of Russian forces down on the border there. So he says that he interdicted that and stopped it by going into this Kursk area. But then you have to ask, if there were all these troops there that were big enough to invade into the northern part of Ukraine again, why have they not engaged against this incursion into Kursk? What else are they doing? Because basically what he's piecing together to tell you there is that there is still a lot of Russian troops in the border region that haven't engaged. They haven't crossed the border. They also haven't gone against his troops there, because Russia actually had to move several thousands of other troops from elsewhere in Russia. That's important to point out, not on the Eastern Front, to contain this, and it has been contained so far. In fact, here, if you could put that Institute for Study of War map up there, this is important to point out here. This is the map on the left side. By the way, I always like to give this comment here. The Institute for the Study of War has terrible analysis, but really good maps. And as we see here, they're very accurate on the front lines. So on the left side, you see that was on August 16th. That was 10 days into their incursion. That was pretty much the forward area there. And you can see that in the 3 or so weeks since that time, and this is as of yesterday, this map on the right, you can see that there's just a little bit of advancement from the Ukraine side to the east, and then a little bit to the west on those sides, but just a little bit. But then they've also lost some territory in the north and the northwest. So Russia has now been starting to eat away at some of the edges of that, while in other areas, Ukraine eats away at some of the outskirt edges, but there's no major change. You see, it's basically the same, just a kind of a blue splotch there, and they haven't gone any further. So then the question is, well, then what's the purpose? And that's what we want to get into next here. So on CNN, you had the General Syrskyi, the commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, was asked specifically about this operation. So you just heard Zelensky say it's been successful, it's meeting its objectives, and so now CNN is going to ask the tactical commander what actually is going on the ground with both Kursk and its impact on Pokrovsk. Here's what he said.
Has it been strategically a success, and even tactically a success, what you've done in Kursk? And do you think you might lose Pokrovsk?
We do everything possible not to lose Pokrovsk. We increased our defense capability in the area. Indeed, over the last 6 days, the enemy hasn't advanced a single meter in the Pokrovsk direction. In other words, our strategy is working. Of course, the enemy has concentrated their most trained units in the Pokrovsk area. But we've taken away their ability to maneuver and to deploy their reinforcement forces from other directions. It turns out that even though they did not take any units from the Pokrovsk direction, well, except for one Marine brigade, they are now unable to maneuver their reserves as they used to.
Okay, a couple of problems here. Number one, he had tacitly admits, or not tacitly, directly admits, that one of their objectives in having this invasion into the Kursk area was to draw some of the main combat units off of the eastern front to relieve the pressure on Pokrovsk, which they recognize is probably the most critical area in the entire eastern front, which Russia's trying to take, and that they want to hold on to. So he acknowledges that didn't work, but then he makes this claim that I can't find any evidence to support it all, which is we have taken away their ability to maneuver and move troops around here. What is he talking about? Because all throughout the Russian area, the Russian-controlled areas, both in Ukraine and then in Russia and in Belarus proper, there's no evidence that Ukraine has done anything except for launch a couple of pinprick strikes here and there with some long-range drones or something, but they don't have the ability to restrict Russian movements. The fact that there weren't any troops moving from Pokrovsk in the east up to the Kursk area isn't because they couldn't do it. It's because they chose not to. More on that in just a second as well. The other thing that he said there, which I think is really important, is that he said to Christiane Amanpour that there has been no movement now. So in the Pokrovsk area. Now, work with me here for a second. They claimed that they recognized that Russia was making this big advancement into the Pokrovsk area, and they had been for a while. I'm going to show you that graphically here in just a second. But he said that their intention for sending all of these thousands of troops and hundreds of combat vehicles up into Russia in the Kursk area was to draw reserves away from there. Then he tells you that they haven't drawn any of the reserves away, so they're continuing to fight. And then he says, and by the way, in the last 6 days, there hasn't been any advancement at all by the Russians. They've basically been stopped cold in the Pokrovsk area, even though they didn't take any troops away, and we did take troops away to fight up in the Kursk area. So even if you have no idea how military operations work, simple math is going to make you go, hang on, how's that working again? Well, fortunately, we do have independent sources, and I'm going to show you something here from the Military Summary Channel, which we use a lot, which is, in my view, if not the best, one of the very best mappers in putting on the ground what's actual and what's real, verified and validated. If he can't validate it by multiple sources, he doesn't put it on there. So I have seen over the last year or so that this channel, that what they report is nearly always exactly accurate. And on those handful, when it's not, then they correct them. So we can take it at face value when he says this about what Syrskyi said. Watch this.
Going to talk about the report of the commander-in-chief Syrskyi. He was interviewed by the CNN during the previous few days, and he reported that as a result of clashes for the previous 6 days, the Russians haven't managed to establish control over even a single square kilometer on the Pokrovsk direction. Of course, we can say that Syrskyi is lying, because if we go back to map, we're going to find lots of updates from different reliable sources about additional progress of the Russians. And according to information we have, the Russians have already established complete control over the landfills in the northern part of Novogrodovka. The Russians captured the landfill of Russia. The Russians captured, but without any confirmation, the landfill of Karachenka. And now the Russians are trying to take under control the landfill and the Terikon of Ukraine.
Now, let me show you a time-lapse photography that's the previous 90 days up till the latter part of August. And you'll see just how rapidly the Russian side has been moving. They picked up a lot of steam in the last 3 months. Watch this this little graphic here. So you see that this is again going from, I think it was June 1st up through the end of August. So even including some of the time when this Kursk invasion had begun. And you see that the Russians are just methodical. So you can understand from the perspective of the Ukraine side, while they needed to do something here. Now, they had a choice to make. They could either send these mobile troops that they had down into the Pokrovsk area where they could help the defenders who were already there, perhaps do mobile counterattacks. It's called active defense. Or they could just fill in some of the gaps, et cetera, because there were plenty down there. But instead, they chose to, well, instead of us taking what's basically their last theater strategic reserves and send them down there, they thought, well, let's punch up in here where we can get a big media play, and especially coming before the Ramstein meeting that the president himself was going to go visit to try to get more ammunition and weapons. They said, hey, let's do this and try to get Russia to weaken itself by moving troops away. And then you see Syrskyi admitted that didn't work. And yet he just claims that it did work on the battlefield. But you can see graphically portrayed there, it's not working. Russia is continuing to move in all different areas there. And then there's also Vuhledar a little bit to the south, where there's now for the Russia's been trying to get that one really for the entirety of the war. All of a sudden now they're starting to make progress in it, and it's in danger very soon of being flanked and cut off. And they're either going to have to withdraw or fight to the death. We'll see what they choose there. In the Toretsk area, Russia keeps the pressure on there, and further up the north in the Kupiansk area, Russia is also making some additional progress. So literally all over the map, that's what's going on here. And so that's one side of it. But let's see what Putin has said, because obviously, if your country has had a military incursion here, and if you're actually losing ground on the West, you're going to be a little bit nervous about things. But tell me whose body language you think is more confident. Is it Zelensky, which we showed you a minute ago, or Vladimir Putin?
The goal of the enemy was to force us getting jittery and moving the troops from one sector of the front to another, and stop our advance at the key front areas in Donbass, first of all. And the advancement in these areas is our ultimate goal. Did they succeed? Nope, they didn't manage to succeed. Our armed forces stabilized the situation and started forcing the enemy out. And the second, which is most important, no actions to contain our advance took place. More than that, relocating their large and well-trained reserves, the enemy got weaker at the key fibers, and our troops accelerated our offensive, and we gained a lot of territory.
So you can see since the 6th of August, now a month in, as Zelensky pointed out in his comments, Russia has accelerated their movements in the east. And it's interesting that he said something there that he has said in recent days as well, that's really eye-opening to many in the West. He said his primary focus and primary objective is the Donbass. Taking the Donbass has been the goal since the beginning of the war, and it continues that way now. Even though his territory was penetrated in the Kursk area, we would normally think that that would become the primary effort, and we would move forces in to contain and then expel that incursion there. But he said even right now, he is not going to be knocked off his primary objective, which is movement in the east. And so he even overtly states to the public, to his own people, as well as to the West, that this incursion is my secondary goal. It's a goal. It's important. And he was telling the people of Russia elsewhere in this conversation, I believe it was, that we are going to get them out. We are working on it. But then again, you have to get to what is the bigger goal for the Russians, because again, Zelensky implied or referenced rather that there had been a large Russian gathering in the north of their border around the Sumy area. Well, those aren't the troops that have contained the Kursk penetration, and they're not very far away. So one would think that those, at least if those troops had been ready to attack into Sumy, that they would immediately be redirected over here to deal with that incursion here. But they didn't. So they're still where they were. What are they there for? Other reports have been coming out over the last several weeks from the Wagner group. You remember when Evgeny Prigozhin and his infamous alleged coup attempt, whatever, where he was driving towards Moscow before he was stopped and then mysteriously was killed a month or so later. Most people say, well, that's the end of Wagner. We haven't heard from him. Well, that may be the last time you've heard about Wagner, but Wagner has actually been accelerating its recruitment in the area, like large-scale acceleration in the Belarus area. We've also talked previously on our channel that the Belarusian army has been massing on the Ukraine border. Those things are still there. The Wagner group has been getting this. I've seen on social media that a lot of the Russians have posted that they've seen large-scale armored vehicles for the Wagner group moving into the area. So we can keep seeing that, but you don't see it showing up on that Kursk area because it appears that Putin is, like said, that's not our big problem here. And then he's also going to talk a little bit more confidently after that comment that he made about the fact that he also recognizes that they're moving faster. Now, you're going to have to read real careful on the bottom. This one is translated in text at the bottom in English, and I'll explain what it said afterwards if you haven't seen it. Watch this.
Вот позавчера только, например, группировка «Восток» прямо в один удар, треугольник захватила 7 на 5 километров. Очень успешно действует группировка «Центр» на Донецком, на Покровском направлении. Там тоже исчисляются уже приобретения не сотнями метров, а квадратными километрами. 4 на 5, 3 на 5 и так далее.
So in that, if you can read it, he is reinforcing that they have been making gains recently in the 5 to 7 kilometers in a single day, or 2 to 3 kilometers here, whereas he acknowledges, and we've talked about this in some cases earlier this year, especially even earlier in the summer, it was measured in maybe 200 meters, 100 meters, 500 meters, something like that. Relatively small gains. In some areas, none at all. Some areas it would have been, a week or 2 or 3 where there was nothing but lots of positional battles, where no changing of territory. Now that's starting to change. So the question is, what impact is that having on the war overall, and what does the Ukraine side think of it? So I want to go back to the CNN interview with General Syrskyi, because to her credit, Christiane Amanpour asked some hard questions, and so I give her credit for this. And some of Syrskyi's answers I'm going to help interpret for you, because he, again, is going to try to put a good face on this one. But the first one here is he was asked that there is a bit of a morale problem in the Ukraine side, and what's he doing about it?
There's a bit of a morale problem in some parts of the front line, that a lot of young conscripts, young trainees are being sent out there. The battle is very difficult for them. Some of them just, leave the trenches and go home. And I think there's something like 19,000 cases that have been brought before the military authorities of desertion and a failure to turn up for duty. We hear that moment of patriotic fervor that was so obvious at the beginning of the invasion seems to be cooling down.
You're right on this point. The issue of morale is a very important area of our work. Of course, talking about the Kursk operation, we should note this is what has significantly improved the morale of not only the military, but the entire Ukrainian population.
Okay, so let's take that also the last one first. His comment that, hey, this has really improved the morale, the Kursk operation, going into Russia, taking the battle to the enemy finally, letting them understand on their own home territory, how ugly war is, et cetera. So it's raised our morale. Okay, that may be true, but that also has a very temporary effect. And it doesn't have a whole lot of effect. We haven't seen any effect on the ground, which is the only place that it matters. And in fact, you saw us with an embassy report, it may have been just yesterday, to where the correspondent went to Kiev and was asking people about that very issue, about how does it strike them. And he said they were happy, that made them feel good. He said, but then they're, quote, scratching their head thinking, and then what? What is this going to mean? So it only will help your morale, and the morale will only help you if it can be translated into action on the ground. So if your people go, yay, cool, there's fighting going on in the enemy's territory for once, that's awesome for me. But now what are you going to do? Because they're not stupid either. Even just regular people who know nothing about military operations, they know that this massive country of Russia, and you have, and I think we talked about the actual math the other day, it's less than 0.001% of Russian territory. So it's not even big enough to be called a pinprick into the country. So, with whatever the actual number is, 10, 15,000 troops, you're not going to invade Russia. You're not even going to be able to stay there unless something else happens. So unless you have an army that's ready to invade into Russia, where you can hold and then expand that territory towards some objective that will help your side that could potentially end the war, then you're asking, what is this for? So now imagine the impact on morale if you, for a moment, think something good, but then all of a sudden you see that those troops in very short order are either going to have to withdraw, which is what they should do. They should withdraw as soon as possible to limit any further the loss in manpower or equipment, because it's a zero-sum situation here. You're just not going to be able to replace. You may be able to replace some of the bodies. You can't replace anybody who's trained, because there's not time to do that. So this has a big impact. So if the people see that you eventually withdraw from there in a relatively short term, or if you get stubborn and pig-headed and say, no, we're going to stay there, which we showed you Zelensky said in a previous interview a day or so ago, and then you see them destroyed, how's that going to help your morale? So if you see the penetration went in and then it either withdrew or was destroyed, so there's a net loss there, and you see because you didn't send those reinforcements that you had to the east, that's also starting to lose ground faster. What's that going to do for your morale? Now, one of the other things that Christiane Amanpour asked him in that clip there that he didn't address, she said that there are up to 19,000 desertion cases on the books right now. That is a huge number. Just consider that. Whatever the actual number of casualties are, killed and wounded and taken off the battlefield, are enormous, and they're growing by the day in many cases, especially when the fighting gets more intense. And then on top of that, you add 19,000 actual cases, and that's what's being reported. There's many others that may not be reported. And we know we have issues with that, of people just leaving the battle and just not, just going home. And so he's not addressing that. So you talk about, you got a morale problem to where your troops aren't even fighting. And then, of course, you got to layer on top of that all these images we keep showing about how the Ukraine side is mobilizing their population. And it's not like they're just sending out orders to show up. They do, and they go to the back. They have these groups that go around the country and grab men off the streets. I saw a new one just earlier this morning. It was just heartbreaking. It was a young kid. I don't know for sure how old, 18, 20, 24, who knows. It's a relatively young kid, skinny as a rail, there was like a ring camera on his front door, and he was terrified because these two guys in uniform come up and they're physically grabbing him, and he's holding on to the rails of his house to not be taken away. But of course, there's two of them. He's not going to be able to stop that. And then they just start just wailing the daylights out of him, just punching him in the face, in the gut, etc., till finally his hands released, and then they grab him, throw him in the van, and take him off. And those happen every day. We see a lot of those. So there is a big morale issue because they see what's going on the ground truth reality. Then that interview continues on with her asking about, what about the rotation of troops? Okay, so you have a morale problem, you have a desertion problem, and you have a shortage in the number of units, not just personnel, but units, which means you can't rotate the units. And she's going to mention that in a second, so you understand what they're asking about here is the way a war normally works. And I mean, going all the way back even into World War II for the United States, World War I before that, a unit like the 1st Armored Division, it would be in contact for a long time, and it would be fighting, and they'd be getting individual replacements, etc. But the unit as a whole, at some point, has to be taken off the line because of the mental strains on them. And the physical exhaustion, they have to be taken off the line, and then a new unit be brought in. I personally witnessed that even in the short Desert Storm ground war, to where our unit, the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, made a breakthrough through an Iraqi armored brigade, and then we stopped and paused there while the 1st Armored Division and the 1st Infantry Division passed through us to continue the war going on. That's how it normally works. In the Ukraine side, however, they don't have units. They're struggling even to get individual replacements to keep brigades at anything close to full strength. And so that means that the unit never gets pulled off the line, which she asked him about.
What do they say to you? Because I know some of them have been there for, more than 2 years. They barely get rotation. They don't get to see their family. There are these glide bombs, these terrifying things and the drones, and there's just so much. I mean, it's almost World War I kind of attacks on them in the trenches. And they're there for a long time with no real hope of rotation. What do they say to you when you go to see them and talk to them?
First of all, we speak the same language. You know that I have been in this war since 2014. And over the last 2.5 years, since the beginning of the full-scale aggression, I've personally been participating in combat operations as the commander of the operational and strategic group. Now I am the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. The front line is my life. We understand each other. I know all the problems that our servicemen, soldiers, and officers experience.
Now, this is the one area where I would have urged Christian to ask a kind of important follow-up question, and since she didn't, I will. He did not answer her question. She said, what about the rotation of units? Because these guys some units and some individuals have been on the line for 2 years. Now, imagine that. You've avoided getting killed this whole time, and you see people dying left and right all around you, and you've still been on the line. I can only imagine what these folks who survived this war are going to be suffering the rest of their lives. I mean, we still to this day still have a lot of American troops that struggle from PTSD from our wars all the way back into Vietnam, much less in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And folks, listen, that was a fraction, especially our current wars, was a fraction of the mental strain that these guys are going through. I can't even imagine. I've got 4 combat deployments by own, and I think the sum total of all of them would be 3 or 4 days in this Ukraine war. Maybe not even that much, because the level of firepower and the sheer terror of the modern battlefield, with drones flying overhead all the time, these explosions happening left and right, artillery rounds, you're always worried about missiles, you can't gather together. I mean, you're in constant fear of death all the time. And it is vital, it is absolutely crucial that a unit be pulled off the line so that it can rest and recuperate, get more troops, and then when you're doing it right, you can actually do some training. I mean, you need to be off the line for a couple of months if possible, so that you can refresh, retrain, and then be ready to go back in a good state of mind, or as good as you can get. They're not getting any of that. So when you don't have enough troops to fill your units, When you don't have enough units to rotate anybody off, and the Russians do, then it is a ticking time bomb until finally the fabric of your armed forces collapses. There's no appreciation of that in the Western at all. In fact, it's not even on the radar of a possibility. But I'm here to tell you that it is a possibility, and that it is possible that one of these days, because of some tactical setback somewhere, that the fabric of the army breaks, and then they recognize that it's futile to continue fighting. And if we've already seen 19,000 individual cases of desertion, that it could be possible that some of these undersized units in mass collapse when they get pushed hard enough. Who knows where it could be? It could be another year. It may never happen. So I can't predict it because there's too many factors that go into it. But I'll tell you, it is absolutely a possibility. The Russians, on the other hand, to note what Zelensky and Syrskyi were talking about there, that they have been seen in large numbers out of contact, that there are somewhere around 250,000 in various parts of southern Russia, not far from the border with Ukraine, that are also not engaged. They're going through training. They're continuing to make themselves better and better, but they're not being used at the front. So again, we have this possibility that possibly in a winter offensive that could be coming up, maybe something earlier in 2025, who knows? But these troops are not. But they do have enough units to rotate people off the line. So some of their units actually are getting some break, and their units themselves have a higher percentage of manpower because they have more men to use into them. So we get back again, and where we always end up landing the ground truth on the battlefield. The Ukraine side, all the fundamentals that go into making and sustaining combat power are being whittled away. We also talk about the Russian missile forces, which are methodically destroying the Ukraine's ability to generate power, which is necessary just to live, to create economic activities, and to create weapons and ammunition, to run the factories. Those things are just being methodically whittled down. They're about to get into the cold season with all kinds of potential hardships on the entire population, not just the military. The people are terrified of coming into the armed forces. And you see that despite Austin's big claims to the contrary, the West doesn't really believe that they're at danger of Russia coming in. That's always bumper stickers to try and mobilize the masses and get them to continue to support. But the people who understand warfare and things like at the higher levels, they understand it's just a bunch of bumper stickers. And so that's not going to animate them to do something. And you see a lot of them, they've given a lot of stuff, but a lot of them like saying, hey, we don't have a lot more to give. And why would I want to give away all of my air defense systems when I see that the ones that have been given are mostly destroyed? And obviously they don't have much success because the Russian missiles are landing everywhere in the country. They're firing them. Whatever percentage are knocked out, and there is some, the percentage that get through is catastrophic for the Ukraine side. And the few that Ukraine is able to fire back on the other side, some of them have success. There was a huge fire at one of the energy infrastructures that burned for days in Russia not long ago. And certainly that's bad for the Russian side, but it's one of probably scores of similar kinds of facilities. And it's not going to make any difference in the war. As you see, it's not making any difference. The one is on the Russian side is harming them, but it also is not decisive by itself. But all of these things combined make it virtually impossible for the Ukraine side to win. Now, I talk about all the time here that should lead to the rational point of view of let's have a negotiated settlement. So I won't go into detail on that, but you see the evidence just screams it. But you also see that the West has not, the one area where they haven't gotten any weak is in their willingness to lie and in their willingness to come up with these fantasies that we want so that we can try and get more stuff. But listen to me, folks. Listen, if Zelensky walked in there with a wish list to Ramstein, where he's at right now, and all of these 50 nations and the representatives of their country said, you know what, we're going to give it all to you. Every single thing on your list that you're asking for, even if it cuts into the bone of our own forces, we're going to give it all to you. It won't matter. It will not matter. It won't change it because the fundamental, that's the most important of all the ones I talk about, it's men, not machines, not money that win and lose wars. And Russia has millions more and they also have the men and machines, money and machines. So it's time to do something different. We'll see what comes out of this the next few days, and what the remainder of their meetings have. I'm sure there's going to be more. We'll bring that to you as we get it. But I just want to make sure that while this meeting is still going on, you know the ground truth reality. That's what Daniel Davis Deep Dive is all about. We are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, and we will continue to do so. We do ask that you like and subscribe to the channel, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.